Günaydın. It is very nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Turkey. And I would like also to congratulate the organizers for coming up with this title of the conference. Let's look at the creative industries from the efficiency point of view. This is the real question. In my little talk, which I will give today, I would like to touch upon 4 issues, if I may. First of all, I'd like to look at intellectual property and copyright as the basis for the creative industries, and maybe offer you a little bit of analysis, an economic analysis on copyright. In the second part, I would like to touch upon some of the results from empirical studies that we have done on the creative industries, global studies. Then I would like to spend a few minutes on the results in Turkey that have been achieved through this research. And finally, I would look into some of the trends and some of the challenges facing creative industries, and hopefully give you some ideas and food for thought for the future sessions of today. So without much ado, we're lucky to be speaking about intellectual property today because it is no longer a subject which is reserved only for the lawyers. Today we all know what intellectual property is. We deal with it on an everyday basis. We have to agree to X number of licensing agreements when we open our computers, when we buy things. So intellectual property has come into the mainstream of the policy debate today, and that makes our task easier. At the same time, we live in a time when culture is no longer considered as a public good. It's more and more considered as a commodity. And there are higher opportunities today to derive income from creativity on a professional level, which of course extends enormously the productive potential of creativity. The term creative industries is a great term because it actually allows us to apply an economic view on cultural policy. Suddenly, culture becomes part of economic policy, and we can mainstream it into our discussion about economic growth and economic policies. And indeed, creative industries have become a powerful symbol of the fastest growing part of the economy. It has an incredible outreach potential. Just this morning, I found about 320 million hits on creative industries, which is much more than any other term that you were used to before. Now, if I tell you that without intellectual property there'll be no creativity, that would not be true. Because there have been great periods in the history of mankind when there was a lot of creativity and there was no intellectual property. So what has changed? Of course, on the one hand, we have new technologies which have enabled us to do great things. But what has also happened is that we have developed new conceptual frameworks. Intellectual property is just a conceptual framework. But this framework allows us to monitor what is the supply and demand of creative products, and it helps us to transform the creative outputs into economic goods and services into a much easier way. So we can obtain some evidence on the impact of creativity. Because I can tell you that we cannot be sure today that we are much more creative than our ancestors. We have no empirical evidence of that. So we have to apply conceptual frameworks such as intellectual property. And intellectual property has become a very powerful indicator of development, and major investors and major policy decisions are based on the intellectual protection in a given country. So it is becoming very closely linked to sustainable development. Now, creativity is a great concept, but it is very difficult to define creativity. Where does it start and where does it end? How do we know that somebody is more creative or that somebody is less creative? In other words, we have difficulties in establishing where are the boundaries of creativity. So here comes the concept of copyright. And copyright was invented as a concept in order to protect and promote creative expressions. In other words, what falls under our concept of copyright would be creative by definition. So in this way, we have an indicator by which we can delimit the scope of the creative industries that are going to be the subject matter of our research. Otherwise, it's a subjective decision to decide these are the 13 sectors that I want to study. We use intellectual property to delimit the scope of the creative industries. And the nicety about this is that we know exactly what is protected under copyright. It's written in the law. Copyright law tells you what is protected. You can transpose that into the statistical categories and you will identify which are the areas that should fall under your definition of creativity and creative industries. As I said, copyright is very well established in the law. We know exactly what it is. It is a set of rights which allow you to decide what to do with your property. It is also a financial mechanism which creators are using to make a living on a daily basis, and it is the basis of big and huge industries. So we know that it works. Now, why are we concerned with economic analysis of copyright? Copyright has been reserved for lawyers, as I said in the beginning. But I can tell you that in our organization in recent years, we have many governments which are coming to us and they're posing the question, can you prove that creative industries are a development factor? In other words, if we are more creative, will this necessarily translate into more economic growth or not? Is there a link, and how can you prove that link? On the basis of these questions, there has been a tremendous interest to creative industries, and I must say that sometimes it has been exaggerated, and creative industries are sometimes presented as the solution to all problems. I don't think that they can solve all problems in society, but they can certainly contribute to the solution of many of them. And the question is, of course, what kind of infrastructure do you need around creativity so that creative industries can become a factor of sustainable development? And indeed, you need to prove that through empirical research, and that is what we have tried to look into. Now, as I said, copyright is a legal concept, but I would argue that it is also an economic concept. First of all, because it has some very clear economic characteristics. It is a private property right, and that is key, because only once you establish what is the ownership of a product or service, only then it can enter into economic transactions. If the ownership is not clear, it cannot be the subject of economic transactions. So it is a property right, but at the same time it has some features of a public good, because the more you share your property, it does not diminish its value. So it has some public good aspects. Now, what are the most important economic functions? Well, the most important function is that it is providing you with a market framework. It is telling you what are the rules of the game. This is how you can trade with your property. This is what is allowed. This is what is not allowed. These are the limitations and exceptions from the law. And in this way, it is a very powerful mechanism which is helping the owner of the property, the right holder, actually to trade with the property, and that the property will be paid according to what the market is prepared to pay for it. Are there some economic consequences of copyright? Yes, there are, because the minute that you change the royalty rates, you're redistributing income in society. There are some important consequences on a macro level, because you're, of course, contributing to creativity, innovation, and in this way you're contributing to the broad welfare objectives. But on the other hand, you also have a certain monopoly position of the owner, because the owner of the property decides what would be the levels of access to the property. Where does he set the boundary? Are there any conditions for economic efficiency? Yes, there are. Number one, of course, the consumers must value that property at a price which is higher than the production and distribution. That's very natural. But on the other hand, the other condition is that you must limit free riding. In other words, if there's too much piracy in society, the concept will not bring back the benefits that it is supposed to give. So if that is true, let's look how this property and how these creative goods and services are traded on the market. And let's look on the demand side. What do we have in the creative industries? We have highest degree of unpredictability. You create a novel and you don't know whether there will be readers for your novel. You write a song and you only hope that people will start liking it. So there's a great risk in this industry, and that needs to be considered when looking at demand. In the past, people were looking at quality, the stars. They were looking at price. Price was an indicator. It is not really the same kind of, doesn't have the same kind of weight, this indicator, because nowadays it seems that there is a demand for everything. You just put out something on YouTube and it's out there. Price is no longer an indicator because people want access today. They don't want to own it necessarily. So it has become less of an important indicator of demand. Demand is always income elastic in this area. You would spend on a creative experience depending on your income, not on the absolute price of this. And finally, piracy has a very negative impact on demand. In some developing countries, I've seen creators who do not record anymore their songs. They say it will be pirated immediately, so I would rather wait for the live show when people will come and experience. What is happening on the supply side in the creative economy? On the supply side, we have differentiated products. These are experience goods, which means that there is no direct substitution. I cannot substitute one song with another one because I like that particular song. You have very low entry barriers. As I said, I create a song, I put it on YouTube, it's out there competing with the songs in which significant amounts have been invested. It's a very skewed market. You have a very distorted distribution of income and risk. 5% of creators perhaps own 95% of the assets in the industry, and the other 95% have to take a second job to make a living. And finally, the nature of cultural diversity is such that there will always be more songs than what we can hear. There will always be more books than what we can read. That means that there is always an excess of supply. Unfortunately, this is bad news for the creator because it weakens the bargaining position of the creator. So this is the market that we have to operate in. Now, summarizing the main functions of copyright in this creative economy, I spoke mostly about the economic function, and the economic function is mostly an enabler. It provides a system of rewards and incentives and certain guarantees for the creator that his or her time will be rewarded. It is a market framework. It allocates property rights in your creative output. And it's a measurement tool because it is an economic category and we can use it as a basis for economic analysis. In terms of the social function, copyright is about balance. It is always reflecting the balance in society, rewarding the creator and at the same time ensuring access to a certain percentage of the works under limitations and exceptions. And copyright can play the role of a catalyst for innovation. On the cultural front, most importantly, by providing these guarantees and incentives to creators, copyright ensures that there will be more cultural diversity and it will contribute to the supply of more creative content. So these are some of the major functions of copyright which I think are important to keep in mind in your subsequent discussions of today. Now, why measure the creative industries? Usually the demand for measuring the creative industries comes from governments, sometimes research institutions, sometimes industry. But the idea is always to see how does this sector compare with the others, How does it compare with the rest of the world? And what are your competitive advantages? So on the basis of this, you take policy decisions. You can measure different things. You can measure everything under the sun. It's a matter of cost. In this case, we're looking at the size of the creative industries. It's just a snapshot. So what do they represent in terms of their contribution as percentage of GDP? What is the employment which they generate? How much trade is generated from the creative sector? But in recent years, we have seen countries coming up with much more interesting indicators and more dynamic indicators. And one of them is, of course, to look at productivity levels, the subject matter of this conference. Countries are also interested in multipliers. In other words, what will be the multiplying effect of an investment in the creative sector compared to traditional investments? We've seen a number of countries doing good analysis of the contribution to real GDP growth by the creative sector. In other words, how much of the GDP growth actually comes from this sector. In our studies, we're mostly concerned with the production side because simply there's more data on production than on consumption. Now, we've done surveys in about 50 countries around the world, and in about 30% of those countries have done more than one study. So the average which we have from these 50 countries is about 5.22% of the GDP on a global average level. And about 80% of the countries are around the 5% mark. You have on top of the list some very developed economies which are really above almost 12% in the US and other countries. And down the list you have very developing economies. But if you look at employment, it's an even more impressive indicator. So we have 5.35% of the employment on average in these 50 countries, which comes from the creative sector. And if you're looking for Turkey, it's exactly at the middle. It's at 5.4%. And you see that on top of our list, you have very developing economies, such as the Philippines and Mexico. Of course, there's a lot of employment there, because everybody is outsourcing to these countries. This is where the employment is. The value is not there. The value is recorded elsewhere. But employment, yes, there is, and employment is a very important social indicator. Now, looking at labor productivity index, you can see that actually on top of our list, we have very small countries and very developing countries. And I can tell you that, of course, this index, everything has to be read in a context. In some of these countries, there's a lot of gray economy and there's a lot of employment which is not officially recorded. And we're only looking at official data. So that's why their productivity index is so high. Now, we looked at the relationship between the contribution to GDP of the creative sector and some other economic indicators. And we tried to see whether there is any relationship between those. And we discovered that actually there is a positive correlation between the contribution of the creative sector to the GDP and such indicators as the one shown on the slide, like foreign direct investment. It's a very high regression coefficient here, 0.57, very positive relationship, followed by global innovation index, GDP per capita, global competitiveness, business freedom, and freedom from corruption. These are indexes which are not prepared by us. We have just taken our data and tried to see whether there's a positive correlation, and indeed there is, which means that both indicators will be going in the same direction. Now, let's look in the core, what we call core copyright industries. Core means that these are industries which fundamentally exist in order to create, produce, and distribute creative content. And among these industries, you may be surprised, but the biggest industry is still the publishing industry. The publishing industry stands for 39% of the value in the core sector. Let's not forget this is one of the oldest industries. That's what copyright was about, to defend the rights of publishers 200 years ago. Publishing is still the biggest industry, 39% on global level, followed by such industries as software and databases, and here we include video games because until recently they did not have a specific statistical category to record. Then we have radio and television, which is very powerful, followed by advertising services, and only then comes music and film, which you would think would come on top of our list. If you look at the employment which is generated, even more employment in publishing, 43% of the total in the core creative sector. And it's followed by the same 5 industries which I mentioned, slightly lower percentages, but again, you've got software, radio and television, advertising, and then film and television. So, on the basis of these studies, 50 countries around the world, some of them, as I said, have done more than once this study. Some of them are doing it every second year. So there's one conclusion you can make: it is a significant contribution. It is a sector which contributes a lot of employment and more value than what was expected in most of the cases. We've seen the drivers. These are the industries which are on the chart. And we've also seen that the creative sector is very well connected with the rest of the economy. It is buying in products and services, and it is selling products and services to other sectors. So we've seen that looking at the economic cycle, at the time of economic decline, this sector shrinks even more. But at the time of economic growth, it grows more. It is more dynamic. It's about 2.5% higher growth rate than the rest of the economy. Now, let's look at some of the results of the study, which we were happy to cooperate with an excellent team of Turkish researchers some years ago. Like all other studies, the study was trying to look at what is the size of the sector, how does it compare with the rest of the sectors, which are the drivers. And the average was about 2.73% of the GDP, 5.4% of the employment. Quite significant part of export, 6.87, and imports were less, 3.83. But I understand that it was not possible to record well the software imports, which were very significant. Now, if you look at the core industries in Turkey, you will see that the picture is similar to what we had as the global averages, with one difference that in your case, radio and television was the highest generator in terms of value, only then followed by publishing and then software and databases. If you look on the employment side, publishing was the biggest industry with some 35% of the core, and then it was followed by software and databases. Advertising services come third, and only then radio and television. Now, I keep speaking of core industries, and I said what the core industries are, but there are other industries that we are looking at, namely what we call interdependent or facilitating industries. Then we also have a group of partial industries where copyright stands only for a portion of their activities. And finally, we have distribution industries where we are measuring spillovers. Now, in the interdependent or facilitating industries in Turkey, what we saw is that the biggest industry here was computers and equipment, followed by TV sets and radio, and then some aspects of the paper industry. And same ratios for the employment in these industries. And if you look at the partial industries, here there is one dominant industry, which is apparel, textiles, and footwear. And mind you, we're only looking at the creative portion of this industry here. We're not taking the entire industry because it is not a creative industry 100%. So there's a coefficient that we apply to all these industries. So this study was based on data from 2011. So perhaps it is time to update it if you would like to see what are the latest trends. But it is a benchmark study. It is a very good study done very thoroughly, as I said, by a very good team of researchers. So you have a group which is ready. They can do an update, which many countries do. And I think the main conclusion of the study was that the creative sector in Turkey is very well connected with the economy of Turkey. Employment, as I said, is commensurate with the levels, with the average levels of the world. Value generation was a bit on the lower end, so there are probably explanations to that, and they should be looked into. In terms of comparisons, the creative sector in Turkey generated more value than the healthcare and social services, hotels and restaurants, and more jobs than the educational sector, healthcare, the financial services, hotels and restaurants, transportation and storage. It is an important sector. It compares with very big sectors in the Turkish economy, and it is very significant. The drivers, we saw them: publishing, software, radio and television, apparel and textile. These are the bigger industries. But in terms of growth, the highest growth was in the film industry in Turkey, which clearly is one of your trademarks in terms of exports. In my country also, your series are top. Now, the legal and institutional framework in Turkey, the copyright side of it, it was largely absolutely comparable with the rest of the world, but some adjustments are needed, and I was very happy to hear from the ministry that you're planning on further adaptations in the copyright law. And I know that it has been under review for some years in relation to some specific aspects. What were some of the challenges that the researchers identified? It's no wonder, of course, level of awareness. Many people are not aware of their rights, what they have. They don't know what to do with them. They don't know how to use copyright in order to derive income from it. So copyright infrastructure is mentioned here in broad terms. It means what is the basis of collective management in the various fields? Is collective management efficient? Are there other rights management mechanisms which are working efficiently? Unfortunately, Turkey is no exception to the rest of the world. You also have significant piracy issues and significant gray economy issues. And gray economy, that means diverting direct income from the state to other players in the economy. And that means a net loss for legal right owners. A big issue, according to the researcher, was the level of demand for creative products. You need to develop the demand if you want to develop the market. And the level of expenditure on entertainment, media, and other products in Turkey was lower than the average for many countries. So how to develop this demand, how to ensure that people will be subscribing to more creative products and services, this is, of course, a big issue. And finally, your statistics, it is very old statistics. It is very old in the sense of with tradition. But of course, if you want to track well what is happening in this sector, you need to make further adjustments. And some countries have made great progress in satellite accounting and other different statistical models for measuring the impact of creativity. Now a few words about some of the trends and some of the digital impacts and digital developments. If we look at the creative output and how the digital is impacting on the creative output, we can say that the digital environment has completely changed the way that business is done. It's simply new business relations, but also you have new possibilities for collaborations and creations, which can happen on a global basis. That's a major difference compared to the past. With the digital also, you have a bigger audience. You can reach out. This creative output can be made available directly to a large group of consumers. And consumers and creators, sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between them. You have new revenue streams, new business models, new platforms. So there's a lot that has changed in terms of the creative output. From the point of view of the consumer is happy because there's an infinite supply, 24/7, of creative content, and it's very diverse. You have incredible amount of gadgets and devices for access, which means that there are new access modes and new access possibilities. You also have a new demand. The demand is changing. The nature of demand is changing. Consumers are spending more time on the internet, on average 4 times per day. They're spending more time on looking at creative products and services. They're much more aware of privacy issues, of viruses, of malware. So the whole set of issues around using the internet is now very high on the agenda, and especially younger generation is extremely well aware of it. So the demand for creative products should be read in this context as well. And finally, you've got lots of distributional effects, because the numbers of users that can use the same product at the same time has increased tremendously. So what are some of the new opportunities and trends that we are seeing now? If we try to summarize them, I think that one of the important changes is that there is a repositioning of the stakeholders. You've got a value chain which has been changed. There's much less that goes into production now. There's much more that goes into marketing nowadays. The phases of the value chain are very compressed. And the developments are so dynamic that you can forget about the stable value chain. Things are very dynamic, they're very changing, they're very complex. So be ready for surprises all the time. The power balance is shifting, and there's a new role for intermediaries as compared to infrastructure owners. Just think about the transformations in the digital age. We live in a world when the biggest retailer in the world, Alibaba, has no stock, no inventory. The biggest taxi company, Uber, owns no cars. The biggest hotel company, Airbnb, they own no hotels. The biggest media company, Facebook, has no content. So where are we going? Something is happening, and all of these are intermediaries, and their role is becoming bigger and bigger by the day. You've got some structural changes in the industry, and I'm very happy that you will break into various segments and you'll be looking at different industries, because the digital impacts are not the same for the different industries. For some of the industries, these have been evolutionary changes. Let's look at painting. I mean, not much has changed in painting because of the digital, right? But in other industries, especially the ones that are born digital, the changes are incremental. Look at video games, look at web design, and many other sectors. You've got technology factors which are impacting on the industries in a major way. Everybody speaks now about blockchain revolutionizing the transparency of transactions on the internet, including in managing your music rights. Look at Imogen Heap. Now, artificial intelligence, it will change a lot of the premises on which we are building today's world and our concepts. What we have here is that content is no longer linked to a specific format. So we have convergence of computing, communication, content. We've got the audiovisual and telecommunication industries merging together. So you have blurred the boundaries between industries, between production and consumption, and we have very good rules for the existing ones. Are we ready to embrace this world where the boundaries are not so clear? Are we ready for that? Of course, industries using the same communication mode means that we can increase efficiencies in them. And that's an important point to take away. Big data can allow us to do many things, but how does it fit with the new privacy laws? And these are big issues. You can do big things with big data, and you can improve on your analytics, but again, this is not straightforward. The process is going from a phase to a phase. Now, what do I think are the most important factors if you want to have a really successful creative industries? This is based on my personal experiences from a lot of countries. First of all, you must need creative content. You must have creators. I think you have an abundance of that. And what you must ensure is that there is a free flow of these creative ideas, creative content. And there is a lot of products out there. And your unique and specific product will win because the competition has become harder. So you need to have a great diversification of content and an ability for this content to move freely. The second group is what I call largely the soft infrastructure. And I'm referring, of course, to copyright and to intellectual property here. So you need to have a balanced and efficient system of intellectual property. an efficient system of management of rights. Sometimes people do not, or they give up on managing their rights because it's too complex. They don't know where to go. They don't know with whom to talk to. They don't know how to collect their money. So the system has to be user-friendly, both to the right owner and to the user. All solutions in a digital world will have to work on a global basis. We're all linked in the global economy, so there must be links to distribution channels. And let's not forget it, intellectual property is one of the ways of doing business. So intellectual property has to compete with other business models out there, and it has to prove that it's better. Sometimes it's difficult to compete with free, but you have to prove that you're providing benefits to the users and to the owners, which make them choose this option. It's no longer the case that there's no alternatives. Again, public awareness and awareness in general on copyrights. I think that the creators need to understand and to know better what they can do with their property on the one hand, and on the other hand, the level of acceptance in society needs to grow. In other words, society needs to get accustomed to the idea that you have to pay for creative work. And of course, there has to be a certain enforcement capacity, otherwise people will not believe in the future of having legal rights. And finally, there's a policy commitment. I have seen that the countries where there's a policy commitment to the creative sector is big, always achieve more in this area. Luckily, we are in a country where creative industries are high on the agenda, so that hopefully will mean that they will be able to flourish even more. Looking ahead, I think that we live in a time when creative industries are very high on the agenda, on the policy agenda. Will this be the case forever? I don't know. In 5 or 10 years' time, there may be something else which will be on top. So now is the time to use the high profile of this concept and to maximize from the enormous potential of the concept. And as I said, you need to look for global solutions. On the economic side, I think it's mostly about monetization. How do you monetize creativity? This is really the crux of the issue. There are many other aspects, but I would summarize them all by one: learn how to monetize. In the research area, there are plenty of directions for future research, and universities are best placed to do research. I didn't go into the debate on definitions, but I can tell that there are many different definitions on creative industries and on the creative economy. Streamlining the definitions, streamlining the metrics, choosing a new generation of indicators, I think these are areas where a lot can be done, and we expect a lot from the academic world. Thank you very much.